Good morning everyone, we are from group 7. My name is Joseph FELIX SHANNON PUTRA SORO, and then my friends will be introduce themselves. So our topic is rules of conversation, MAXIM. So what we are gonna talk about it, the first one is introduction. This introduction takes from Greece, the introduction to Greece conversational theory. The first one is Paul Greece introduced a framework to explain how people cooperate in conversation. The second is the theory highlights how meaning is interpreted beyond literal language. The third is communication is guided by the cooperative principle. The fourth is cooperative principle is realized through 4 conversational maxims. And the last one is these maxims explain how speakers and listeners work together to achieve effective communication. So without any further ado, let's get into it. The first one is Paul Greece, who was a British philosopher whose work has had significant influence on modern linguistics, especially in the field of pragmatics. Greece observed that everyday communication is highly efficient and usually very successful, not because speakers always express themselves perfectly, but because they follow shared social expectation about how to talk and how to interpret what others say. He developed a theoretical framework to explain this cooperation. According to Greece, conversation is coordinated activity. Speakers aim to be understood, and listeners assume that speakers are trying to be helpful. This shared expectation forms the foundation of how we interpret meaning in a context, including meanings that are not especially stated. Second one is one of the most important contributions of Greece theory is the idea that meaning in conversation extended far beyond the literal words used. In many cases, what speaker intends to communicate cannot be found directly in the sentence they utter. Instead, listeners rely on the clues from the context, share knowledge and assumptions about cooperation to extract additional meaning. For example, if someone says, "It's cold in here," they may literally be commenting on the temperature, but in many contexts, the listeners understands that this sentence implies a request to close the window or turn off the air conditioner. Greece theory explains how these non-literal interpretations are systematically derived, making it easier to understand a conversational implicator and hidden meaning. The third one is at the center of Greece theory is the cooperative principle, which states that participants in a conversation should make their contributions appropriate to the purpose and direction of the interaction. This principle does not mean that speakers are always kind or polite. Rather, it suggests that speakers generally try to understandable, logical, and relevant. The cooperative principle gives listeners a foundation for interpreting utterances. When something seems unclear, incomplete, or irrelevant, listeners look for additional meaning that makes the speaker's contribution fit the principle. This is how implicator arises when a speaker appears to violate the cooperative principle. The listener searches for a more meaningful explanation that aligns with cooperation. The fourth one is to explain how the cooperative principle functions in everyday communication. Greece identified 4 conversational rules known as the Grecian maxims. The maxims of quantity, the maxims of quality, the maxim of relevance, and the last one is the maxim of manner. These maxims represent what speakers typically expect from one another during conversation. They are not strict rules, rules but shared guidelines that enable communication to flow smoothly. When these maxims are followed, conversation becomes clear and efficient. When they are broken intentionally or unintentionally, listeners recognize this and even additional meaning, which GRACIE refers to as implicator. The last one is the maxims help clarify how communication functions as a collaborative process. Speakers use the maxims to shape their utterance in the way that are understandable and informative. Meanwhile, listeners rely on the same maxims to interpret what is said, including hidden or implied meanings. For example, if a speaker provides less information than expected, listeners assume that speaker has a reason. Perhaps the full information is not known, or the speaker is hinting at something else. Thus, the maxims bridge the gap between what is said and what is meant. They show that communication depends on mutual expectation and shared reasoning. Through this cooperation, both literal meaning and deeper implication can be understood, enabling rich, meaningful interaction. And then we move to the cooperative principle. GRACIE formulated the cooperative principle as follows: make your contributions such as require that the stage at which it occurs by the accepted purpose or direction to the top exchange. This means that speakers are expected to provide information that is helpful, relevant, clear, and fruitful. The cooperative principle supports smooth interaction and enables listeners to derive both explicit meaning and implicit meaning. To operationalize the cooperative principle, GRACIE proposed four conversational maxims: quantity, quality, relevant, and manner.
Now we move to the first maxim, which is maxim of quantity. So this maxim focuses on the amount of information provided by the speaker. It instructs the speakers to contribute only as much information is needed, no more, no less. When a speaker gives insufficient information, the listener is forced to infer what might be missing. For example, when a mother asks her child whether all homework has been completed, and the child responds only by saying, "I finished my history homework," the mother understands that the remaining homework is probably not done. This understanding arises from the expectation that the speaker should provide a complete answer. Conversely, giving too much information may confuse the listener or distract from the main point. Thus, the maxim ensures clarity and balance. And then the next maxim is maxim of quality. This maxim requires speakers to be truthful. They should not say anything they believe to be false, nor should they make statements without sufficient evidence. This maxim forms the foundation of trust in communication. For instance, if Tom says, "I can bake my family's favorite chocolate cake," listener naturally assume he has done it before and has the evidence to support his claim. If he has never baked the cake and is merely guessing that he can do it, he violates the maxim. This shows how easily communication can break down when speakers do not adhere to truthfulness.
And next, we have maxim of manner. Maxim of manner is about how things are to be said, like to avoid ambiguity in a conversation. And there are four sub-key principles. The first one is to avoid obscurity in expressions, such as don't use unfamiliar references to your audience, to your listener, or maybe don't use ambiguous metaphors. Second is to avoid ambiguity. To avoid ambiguity means to make sure that the phrases you use, it won't misunderstood by the listener or the reader. And then third, be brief, such as you have to be short, and clear, not rambling or overly long explanations. 4. Be orderly. Organize your words, organize your directions or informations in a logical sequence so that listeners will follow what you're trying to say. And all of this matter is because it gives the comprehensions and clarity to understand of what we are trying to say to the listener, and the listener won't infer it into something else. And this also relates to the relevance in context. There are many examples of this maxim of manner. For the first example is, hey, do you know how to get into the library? Oh yeah, you can just, from here you can go right and then climb up to the stairs, then turn left. You can see the sign of the library on the left side. That is the example of clear, ordered, brief, and unambiguous conversation. The next example, the second one. Hey, do you know where the library is? Oh yeah, the library, it's like, you know that building over there? Yeah, it's the one where there are books and stairs, and you can just go there and climb up the stairs, and then I think you turn left, it might be there. That is what maxim of manner said about obscurity, ambiguous, and long-winded explanations. But there are also something that, such as intentionally violating the rule of maxim of manner. For example, did you do your homework? I did something about it last night. That is the example of violating the maxim of manner, because the speaker is trying to make sure that his or her explanation is vague, such as maybe the speaker hasn't done it, or maybe the speaker don't want to tell the truth, such as like that, and the listener may infer to something else. So there are tips of maxim of manner here. The first one is to make sure that you have the clear vocabulary or references or metaphors that you are going to use. You use clear words that are suitable for the listener that you're going to speak to. And then second is to make sure everything is one clear idea per sentence. So it's short and brief. And make sure to order your sentences, your informations, directions, such as don't jump from step 1 to step 3, or maybe don't jump from one story to another story that maybe it irrelevant to the context. And last is that if you want to be vague, be aware that you are violating the rule of maxim of manner, and the listener may infer your information for something else.
Now, for the last part of our presentation is about maxim of relation, which is one of Gracie's conversational maxims. So far, we've looked at how speakers cooperate in communication through the other maxims, and this final maxim focuses on relevance in conversation. So first, the definition and rules for maxim of relation. Speakers should make contributions that are relevant to the topic. Each utterance must logically connect it to what came before, helps maintain a smooth conversational flow, and stay related to the topic and avoid unrelated responses. So it simply means that we should make contribution relevant to the ongoing topic. In other words, what we say needs to logically relate to what the other person has said. When we stay on topic, the conversation flows naturally and meaning becomes easier to understand. So here, for the examples, there is two kinds of example. The first one is relevant responses, which is following the maxim, and the second one is irrelevant responses. So I will read the relevant responses first. So here, what time does the movie start? At 7:30. Next, are you feeling any pain right now? Yes, in my lower back. So you can see here the responses still relevant to the question, to the topic. So which means following the maxim. The relevant responses clearly follows the maxim of relation because it answers the question directly. And then for the next example is irrelevant responses, which mean violating the maxim. Here the example: did you finish the assignment? I really want to go to Bali someday. For the irrelevant responses, the answer becomes confusing and unrelated. You can see the response here. I really want to go to Bali, which means there is no relevance to the question. This kind of response breaks the maxim because it doesn't connect to the topic at all. So it means violating the maxim. When the maxim is violated accidentally, it usually leads to the misunderstanding or awkwardness. Listeners may need to ask for clarification or repeat the question because the conversation has lost its direction. Next is flouting the maxim. What is flouting the maxim? Flouting the maxim is when a speaker deliberately gives a response that unclear, irrelevant, too long, too short, or not truthful to create an indirect message. So it's not a mistake, but it's a communication strategy. However, the maxim of relation can also be flouted, and this happens when a speaker intentionally gives an irrelevant response to communicate an implied meaning. For the example here, is he good at time management? And then the response is, well, he always arrives when the meeting is almost over. So the response is implying that he's always late. And then for the next example is, did you enjoy her cooking? Well, I'm still alive. You can see here that the response is implying the food was bad. So here, the speaker is technically not answering the question directly, but the listener can imply the hidden message. So the next is, why do people flout maxims? So people do this to be polite, soften criticism, be humorous or sarcastic, hint or imply something indirectly, avoid being too direct or rude. So flouting is common in sarcasm, humor, and politeness. Instead of responding directly, speakers allow the listener to interpret the implied meaning on their own. This shows that breaking the maxim isn't always a mistake. Sometimes it's used to strategically to soften criticism, avoid being too direct, or create a humorous effect. Next is the importance of maxim of relation. So why is the maxim of relation important? First, keeps conversation clear and coherent. So it helps conversation stay coherent and focused, because when speakers stay relevant, the listener can easily follow the topic without getting confused. Second is prevents misunderstanding. So it prevents misunderstanding by ensuring that responses are meaningful within the context. And the third, shows cooperation between speakers. It reflects cooperation between speakers. When we respond appropriately, we show that we are paying attention and engaging respectfully in the interaction. And then for the last, maxim of relation important in pragmatics and teaching communication. So in conclude, the maxim of relation reminds us that effective communication is not just about speaking, but about staying relevant and connected to the topic at hand. By following this maxim, conversation become clearer, smoother, and more meaningful, and even when it's intentionally flouted, speakers and listeners work together to interpret the implied meaning. So that's all our presentation. Here we are at the end of our presentation. Thank you for listening and watching. See you when I see you. Have a good day.